Welcome to EDU World Space.
For this question, first we need to review the concept of gain from trade. Here we have a supply and demand graph, and this is the initial equilibrium. We have P star as the equilibrium price in a closed economy. Now let's say the economy is open to trade and the world price is lower than the domestic equilibrium price. World price is denoted as a dashed line in blue. So let's look at the change in consumer surplus and producer surplus. In a closed economy, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price line. This is consumer surplus. Producer surplus in the closed economy is the area above the supply curve and under the price line. Okay, so what happened when the economy is open to trade with a lower world price? Now you can see that consumer surplus will increase. So you will add to the initial consumer surplus this area. Producer surplus decrease. So producer surplus lost part of it to consumer surplus after trade, and now producer surplus is only this area. These surplus are still compatible with the definition. They must be under the demand curve for consumer surplus, above the supply curve for producer surplus, and they are divided by the equilibrium price line. And in an open economy, the price line is the world price. So what is the gain from trade in this graph? This triangle right here is the gain from trade. You can see that the size of this triangle depends on the slope of the supply and demand curve. In other words, it depends on the elasticity of supply and demand curves. We are considering elasticity of the demand curve here. So let's say D here is the initial demand curve. Now I will make it more elastic. I will make it more elastic by flattening it down. I will tilt this line like this. Okay? We call this a more elastic demand curve. Everything else is the same. And now, do you notice what happened to the gain from trade area? This area gets larger. So when demand is more elastic, gain from trade increased. Therefore, this statement in part A is true. For part B and C, I will use the same graph because these two questions all deal with the same situation, a perfectly inelastic demand. The demand curve is a vertical line. Now, similar to the situation before, this is the initial consumer surplus. And this is the initial producer surplus. When the economy is open to trade, equilibrium price decreases from P star to the world price WP. And this area, the rectangular area, represent the gain in consumer surplus. We have another triangle that represent the gain from trade. So you could answer true to both statements. There is a gain from trade, which is represented by this black triangle, and this area belongs to the new consumer surplus, so consumers still gain from trade. However, okay, let me finish writing that down. All right. However, you can also answer false to both statements because mathematically, or first economically, consumer surplus is infinite. When the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, there is no change in quantity demanded no matter how prices change. So, an increase or decrease or adding or subtracting from infinite always results to infinite. Consumer surplus before and after trade is infinite. So actually, there is no change. I think you can argue both ways for both statements, and it is up to you to decide which explanation is more reasonable to you.